Hello and welcome back to What If Harry Potter was set in the world of Aragon? What if spells like Avada Kadavra siphoned off portions of the caster's life, or potions like Liquid Luck gave you a perfect day in exchange for all the good fortune for the remaining years of your life? I have a very simple goal today. It's to take the soft magic system of Harry Potter and turn it into a hard magic system that you might be familiar with from other authors like Brandon Sanderson or Patrick Rothfuss or Christopher Paolini. I'm going to apply some rules and laws and limitations in order to provide some stakes to the magic in this world. And in doing so, I'm hoping I can maybe fill some plot holes or make the world feel like there's some consequence to your actions. You can't just use Wingardium Leviosa to lift any object in the world with no limit. Polyjuice Potions can't be so easy to obtain. You get the picture. So for each of the spells on my list, I've devised 5 different categories of rules that are going to help constrain the magic in a way that I think might help improve it. So the 5 laws in no particular order. 1, the law of physics. This is going to account for mass and movement. 2, the law of body. This is going to apply for things that are related to the biology of the people casting magic spells. 3, the law of sacrifice, aka some sort of equivalent exchange rule. 4, the law of mind, which is going to relate to, you guessed it, things that happen in your head. And 5, the law of fate, things that are related to probability or chance or luck. You get the picture. So I'm going to go through each spell and basically stress test it. What do I think stands out as a problem with it, and how might I rein it in? And if you're starting to type a little message in the comments right now about how magic is whimsical in Harry Potter and I'm destroying the sanctity of J.K. Rowling's beautiful piece, bad news, you're not gonna like this video, all right? For everyone else that enjoys Brandon Sanderson type of rules in their magic, keep on watching. Let's dive into the first spell. Wingardium Leviosa. I thought I would start out with something light to sort of get us up to speed on what I'm proposing in this world. Wingardium Leviosa is a really interesting one to me because in some ways it's one of the most basic spells, but in some other ways it seems to sort of open up a lot of opportunities for broken things in this universe. It's a spell that is introduced to us very, very early on in book 1. We see it used all the time. Ron very famously uses it to save the day. Hermione had sunk to the floor in fright. Ron pulled out his wand. Not knowing what he was going to do, he heard himself cry the first spell that came into his head. Wingardium Leviosa. The club flew suddenly out of the troll's hand, rose high up into the air, turned slowly over, and dropped, with a sickening crack, onto its owner's head. The troll swayed on the spot and then fell flat on its face, with a thud that made the whole room tremble. Now, I feel like maybe I have to cut this spell some slack. It was introduced very early on, before, presumably, anyone thought this was going to be a 7-book series that needed to have consistent rules throughout it. That said, there is no discussed limit to what Wingardium Leviosa can lift. Ron lifts this troll's club. The troll is mentioned as being 12 feet tall, which I would have to assume the club is at least, 6 feet long. Imagine a 6-foot long chunk of a tree. That's definitely heavier than Ron is, and he's able to lift it without any impact to himself. Presumably, more skilled wizards could lift much heavier objects just by concentrating harder. Ron is certainly not the most powerful wizard in the world as a 11-year-old casting this successfully for the first time, right? How much weight could Dumbledore lift? Could he lift a building? What's the limit there? Which brings me to my first law. The law of mass. As it relates to Wingardium Leviosa, I think it's a quite simple solution, and it's simply that either some or all of the weight being lifted by the spell is transferred to the caster. Now, I think there are 2 ways to potentially approach this. You either become heavier as a single being, or that weight is pressed down on top of you. And I think there's 2 different outcomes here. If you just become heavier, maybe it limits your mobility. You get stuck in place, like you're over encumbered in Skyrim if you lift too much weight. The alternative is that if you try to lift an object that is too heavy, you are literally crushed. There's gonna be a bit of a theme in this video wherein I think a lot of the rules that I'm suggesting would make this story quite a bit darker So buckle in for that. I'm imagining a world where Ron suddenly casts Wingardium Leviosa and has the weight of this troll's club pressing down on top of him. That's survivable, I'm sure, but imagine you tried to lift something that was much, much heavier than you thought it was and found yourself flattened on the sidewalk. Suddenly, with a very simple tweak, you can't just run around trying to levitate things, because the consequences could be quite dire. But if that's not enough, I want to offer a suggestion, maybe to lessen the load, so to speak. Maybe only a portion of that weight gets transferred on top of you so that you don't just get pancaked by every random thing that you try to lift up. But maybe the counter to that is a second law that I'll propose, which is the law of body. And in this case, I would propose some sort of caloric tax. You probably see where I'm going with this. This is quite similar, I think, to some ideas presented in Aragon, wherein the thing that you're doing with magic would be just as taxing as if you were doing it by hand. So maybe lifting a super, super heavy object won't literally smash you, but if you did lift an object that was 10,000 pounds, it would have the same caloric requirements as lifting that 10,000 pounds by hand. So you would very quickly find yourself completely exhausted. Lifting a few heavy objects would basically make it look like you've spent the last few hours in the gym. If you lift too heavy of an object, you might actually put yourself into a coma just based on the caloric output of what you've done. But it at least puts some limits around what's possible with the spell. And though minor, there is one small spin-off idea from this that might be interesting, which is that suddenly Wingardium Leviosa is somehow also a feat of strength, which might imply that there's probably more students in the gym at Hogwarts than there would initially have been. So Harry getting swole is definitely on the curriculum every year. He's got a few good hours devoted to physical education. Hagrid strikes me as a very much a gym teacher energy, so I feel like he would be the one down there training the students. There's not a lot of bodybuilder. Everyone in Harry Potter is very wiry. Crabbe and Goyle, I guess, would be potentially the strongest wizards if strength is an actual requirement here. Apparition. Okay, on to the teleportation spells. This one has a plethora of issues, but let's just dive into it. There's a few things that are alluded to in the book that I don't think go far enough. For instance, there's often mentioned a crack or a pop when someone apparates near you. I don't know that it's ever explicitly explained, but I'm guessing that the explanation is that there's a vacuum and it's cavitation is what's causing the pop. But again, I don't know that it's going quite far enough with just a little pop. And the other component I want to talk about is splinching, which is kind of presented as just a oopsie and not losing a limb by accident. I think those consequences could also be leveled up a little bit. So again, let's start with the law of mass. We know that apparating makes this pop or crack, but we also know that if you're skilled enough, you can avoid it and apparate silently, like Dumbledore does. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. So Dumbledore is obviously skilled enough that he can apparate in a way that it doesn't make a sound, which logically I guess you could explain in this instance as he can somehow slow the vacuum effect in a way that it doesn't make a pop. Cavitation, when you're talking about a small little area, is already loud enough. If you're talking about a human-sized vacuum suddenly instantaneously appearing, the collapse, I think, would be much, much more violent than what's shown. It shouldn't just be audible. It might actually shatter the windows around you, or if you're standing right next to someone that apparates, you might concuss yourself just by standing next to an apparator. And so I think that the skill involved here is maybe like what Dumbledore's doing in trying to slow that vacuum from disappearing. And so you have to not only transport yourself, but you also have to simultaneously swap in air from where you're going in a way that would fill that vacuum slowly. Which brings up another topic. When you apparate to another space, presumably you push the air out from where you're going, because otherwise apparition would be like a one-way ticket to an embolism. All the air would just be inside your body. That doesn't seem right. So maybe the more skilled apparators have a way of swapping the air from where they're going to where they're coming from so that they fill that void, they fill that vacuum, and they minimize the pop. Welcome to trying to film a YouTube video with a brand new puppy. Oh, hello. Do you want to speak? Yeah. I guess we're done for today. Okay, it's a day later. Let's try this again. Continue on where I left off. I would argue that the majority of witches and wizards, when they apparate, are not at all good at it, because I don't think most people are good at magic in this world to begin with. And so I think that the shockwave that they create is probably enough to like shatter windows and break glasses, and it's definitely not a stealthy thing to do. And so in order to minimize this, you have to find a way to reduce that vacuum cavitation effect, which I think has to be done by sort of splitting your mind, King Killer Chronicle Quoth style, and transferring air from where you're going to where you came from, so that you're minimizing the cavitation and the vacuum created. But I think in doing that, in splitting your mind and focusing on too many things, you are increasing the risk of splinching. Which brings me to the mind rule. We can first take a look at the context of how splinching happens and the effects from Half-Blood Prince. There was a horrible screech of pain, and everyone looked around terrified to see Susan Bones of Hufflepuff wobbling in her hoop, with her left leg still standing 5 feet away where she had started. The heads of house converged on her. There was a great bang and a puff of purple smoke, which cleared to reveal Susan sobbing, reunited with her leg, but looking horrified. Splinching, or the separation of random body parts, said Wilkie Twin-Cross dispassionately, occurs when the mind is insufficiently determined. You must concentrate continuously upon your destination, and move without haste, but with deliberation, thus. So, the book lays out consequences for splinching. I just don't think they go far enough. I think the fact that you can just kind of wave a magic wand and throw some purple smoke or whatever at it, and it reunites her leg, kid stuff, right? I think splinching should in some way be permanent, or at the very least, not something that can be easily remedied. So, as you're trying to improve your apparition skills, and you're working on minimizing this shockwave that happens every time that you apparate, which I think would become like a hallmark of new apparators. It'd be like when people get their driver's license and they have student driver stickers on the back of their car, student apparators would be causing huge explosions everywhere they go. Maybe it wouldn't be incredibly damaging. You could just cast Reparo and fix anything. So I don't think it even matters if you shatter windows. I think that would be like the hallmark of a new apparator, is someone that's just destroying stuff everywhere they go. So as you work on improving that skill, you have to balance this risk of you start really small and you start trying to reduce that pop effect, but this increases the risk of splinching because your mind is not focused on taking your body somewhere. And I think the other part of this mind rule here is that apparition, I think, would be much more disorienting than how it appears in the series. I think that if you were using apparition in combat, kind of like Nightcrawler style jumping around here and there, I don't know that would be possible. I think that moving through space that far might affect your mind in a way that's going to cause disorientation and cause you to have to come back to your wits after you arrive at the place where you're going. You have this sort of teleportation fatigue that happens that takes a few seconds to sort of come to your senses. And finally, moving on to the body rule. This one might be a bit of a stretch, but recently the Hyperion series came up in my mind, and I thought, how might that apply to this? And I don't know who's read this, but there's a method of faster than light travel in this Hyperion series where the body gets disintegrated and then you have to be resurrected once you arrive at the destination. And part of me wondered about like, okay, J.K. Rowling has set some rules and boundaries around you can't apparate too far, but what if there was some rule wherein you could apparate further just at the cost of bodily harm? You sort of push yourself just a little bit further, and you're traveling such a far distance at such a great speed that it is sort of damaging you in some way, and maybe you have to do some healing magic once you get there to offset that fact. I don't know. Maybe you can only apparate super long distances if you have Horcruxes. Like, maybe that's something that only Voldemort can do because it's going to destroy his body when he arrives. Those 3 rules, I think, round out Apparition in a way that makes it a little bit more satisfying, makes the stakes a little bit higher, makes it so you can't just hop around everywhere willy-nilly. And again, I think then you'd have this sure sign of a really experienced apparator, because they wouldn't have any of the hallmarks of the loud bangs. They would be able to go super far distances. They wouldn't be as fatigued when they arrive. I think there'd be a lot of interesting parts to push that a little bit further. Time turners. Okay, there's not a video that I can do that doesn't include time turners, but I think this is a really interesting one to try to fix. I think time travel within Harry Potter is really not as bad as it's cracked up to be, but there are some problems that I think, are worth taking a look at. So a couple things. First of all, the casualness with which Hermione is allowed to use a time turner is a bit of a problem, and I want to solve that in the coming rules. Also, the way that time travel works in Harry Potter is this bootstrap type of paradox where everything that you do change has already happened, therefore nothing can actually change. And I know it narratively works in book 3. I think it's just kind of not as satisfying as I want it to be, to know that they didn't really change anything with the time turners. There wasn't really a point to them in the first place. There was and there wasn't at the same time. It's like Schrodinger's time turner. So all in, I think this is an item and a type of magic that's going to require me to use body, fate, mind, and physics to fix it. They're not in any particular order, but we can start with the body rule. This one I think is kind of the easiest and might actually exist in this world. We just don't know. And that's just that time travel has to age the person doing it. Maybe it has to be at a commensurate rate. I don't know. Maybe it has to be greater or less than, but there has to be an effect to your age when you time travel. And it might just be you go back and do that amount of time again, you age that amount of time. This, I think, manifests in kind of some interesting ways, though, because for Hermione's sake, who cares? She probably only ages like an extra month within her school year of using the time turner every day. But imagine a society where there's some noticeable facet of time travel that it almost becomes like a social status. You see people that are like have time travel age, and somehow we're like gonna loop all the way back into that Justin Timberlake time movie again, but you get the point. It opens up the door for some really interesting ways of building the world, specifically related to time travel. And a more wholesale shift I would make is in the Law of Fate category. So this is one where I think we kind of shift the way that time travel works in Harry Potter, and it's not this bootstrap closed loop thing. It's a time travel where you can actually go back and affect things yet to come. So what I would propose is that the universe finds a way to solve any paradoxes that you create, and that's kind of without your consent. If you go back and save someone's life that is going to die, someone else has to die to take their place. I think honestly, it makes a little bit more sense if it's at least related to the person that did the saving. Just again, so that there's some stakes to what people are doing here. You can't just change history and expect nothing bad to happen. This could be an interesting way to explain why maybe Dumbledore didn't go back in time to save the Potters, for instance. Maybe Dumbledore didn't do that because he knew that making a change of that magnitude would cause an equal change on the opposite side. It's a little bit like the equivalent exchange thing, but I think it still kind of works with fate. Anyways, moving on to mass, which I think is an interesting one. When people travel back in time, at least in the movies, they move back in time in the place where they're standing. So one suggestion that I would make that might actually solve this limit of how far back you can go is something that I would maybe refer to as like atmospheric displacement, so that when you're traveling back in time, you're actually traveling through quite a bit of air and space to get back to where you want to go. And so physically pushing through all that material would actually heat you up. It would be like re-entering from orbit. And so there's a limit to how far back you can travel just because your body can't take it after a certain point. I think, again, maybe some interesting consequences here is that someone that does push the limits and travels back just a little bit too far, they show up and like their robes are on fire or their eyebrows are like singed off or something. And maybe if you push it even a little bit further, you do end up like burning up. But again, then it puts some stakes around why you can't travel that far back into the past, because it's literally impossible because you will burn up upon re-entry into that timeline. And lastly, we get to the law of sacrifice, which I took a different spin on this one, and I'm gonna think of it more in sort of an economical sense, because what if whatever's powering a time turner, some sort of magical material, call it like sand, is limited, and once you use all of it, it's gone. And I don't know if that's like locally for your time turner, or if it's that scarce in the whole world. Maybe it's like Dune style spice, but one way or another, it's limited. And so it raises the stakes of using the time turner each and every time, which would make it all the more unbelievable that they would give Hermione something that would be scarce enough to like go to war over. But then that had me thinking, okay, where do you get the time sand or whatever is used in the time turner? Maybe it would be going to places in the world that had like huge amounts of natural magical energy shooting out of the ground or something, or you enter sort of rifts like your, Red Rising mining, whatever the Reds mine that I can't remember at this point. Like you have to go in these super dangerous places to mine the material that works with time turners. Maybe it's more like chronologically dangerous, wherein if you go in, time is moving at like random increments around you. So you might go in for 4 seconds and age 40 years, or you might age a millennium instantly. Like it would be incredibly dangerous to go in and mine more. So logically, only like the wildest, craziest people would be going in there to mine it, and it would be extremely expensive to purchase and extremely rare. I don't know, there's a lot of like room to play with that idea. Maybe there's logically a way that you can use skill to avoid the chronological damage that might happen. So therefore there is like a currency involved in the skill that's used to harvest the time sand. All in, I think all these things start to put some boundaries around the time turner to make it a more believable piece of magical equipment within the world, because it's capable of such extraordinary things. It just doesn't line up with giving it to child Hermione. It should be something that's fought over and has stakes and can cause real damage, or is scarce in some way. And so knocking them all over and shattering them in the Department of Mysteries by accident is not a satisfying way to end and close that narrative loop. I think instead, make the stakes way higher, make the material used in them super rare, make the magic dangerous, make fate conspire against you if you use it. A lot of ideas here, but overall, maybe that helps rein it in a little bit more. Polyjuice Potion. Okay, the Polyjuice Potion is an interesting one. I think that as practical and useful as the Polyjuice Potion is, it is just way too easy to obtain and use and brew from scratch. I don't care if Hermione is a child when she brews it, and it's just a testament to how smart she is. If she can do it, it's not that hard. Realistically, the fact that all you need is some hair from somebody and add it to the base stock of the potion, and suddenly you can steal their identity, it's way too low cost and it's way too easy. And so to fix it, I've got 2 laws to introduce. 1, a law of body, and 2, a law of sacrifice. We'll start with the law of body. This comes from the original time that they transformed in Chamber of Secrets. I want to preface that it does originally describe this process as painful. I just don't know that it goes far enough. Immediately his insides started writhing as though he'd swallowed live snakes. Doubled up, he wondered whether he was going to be sick. Then a burning sensation spread rapidly from his stomach to his very ends of his fingers and toes. Next, bringing him gasping to all fours, came a horrible melting feeling as the skin all over his body bubbled like hot wax. And before his eyes, his hands began to grow. The fingers thickened, the nails broadened, and the knuckles were bulging like bolts. His shoulders stretched painfully, and a prickling on his forehead told him that his hair was creeping down towards his eyebrows. His robes ripped as his chest expanded like a barrel bursting its hoops. His feet were agony in shoes 4 sizes too small. Okay. It is originally described as a very painful process. The only problem is the very next line, we just kind of like forget about it, and it's okay. And I think that's not enough. I think the fact that we see some 12-year-olds do it means that it had to be not that bad, but in reality, we don't have to cater the effects of this potion to 12-year-olds. We just cater it to adults that would be using it on a regular basis to do dastardly things, right? And so, from the law of body comes, I think, a rule around the pain that has to come with using a Polyjuice Potion. If you regrow or shift your skeleton over the course of 60 seconds, I think that pain should maybe be debilitating, at least for some period of time. So much so that it should dissuade literally anyone except the most determined people from ever using a Polyjuice Potion. Now, how exactly it gets balanced, I'm not totally sure. Maybe the pain is really more pronounced after you return to your original form, so that, the recovery takes maybe days or weeks instead of just instantly going about your day. I think maybe that's how you counter it. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be a functional tool in your magical tool belt. But I think either way, this has to be a less accessible potion to use, because realistically, that brings me to my next law, the law of sacrifice. This potion is way too easy to access, and it should have a higher barrier to entry. And I think that starts with the DNA that you take from somebody else. I think there might be tiers here of successful potions. I think depending on what you take from somebody, your Polyjuice Potion is not going to be as efficient or successful at transforming you into that other person. I think there's probably a gradient here. Maybe you pass as that other person from a distance, but if you get up close, it's very clearly you're some sort of weird hybrid person. I think the reality is that in order for this potion to be truly effective, you might need to permanently take something from somebody else. You would maybe have to chop a finger off or something. Think about how it would be approached if this were an adult novel. And I think the damage you would do to someone would be more permanent, and that would be used to make a perfect Polyjuice Potion. I guess potentially the only perfect way would be some sort of murder, I guess, wrapped up into the potion somehow. That would really make it quite dark, but I don't know if you need to go quite that far, but still, I think the ingredients that you need to put into the potion need to be harder to obtain than just rifling through Snape's cabinet to find what you need. I think there needs to be some real stakes to what you need to put into the potion to make it work. And the main reason I was thinking about this was because what's to stop somebody from making ready to use Polyjuice Potion and selling it on the black market, just add hair type of potion, right? If I were in the position where I could sell something like that, yeah, you just make the potion with everything minus the one piece of DNA that you need to add to impersonate somebody. You have a very ready to go turnkey identity theft solution. All you need to do is add hair, right? I don't think that sets itself up to be realistically guardrailed in society. I think people would be using that kind of stuff all the time with obviously no consent from the person they're impersonating. And so I think you need to raise the stakes a little bit more, which overall, when you add these two rules, I think makes the Polyjuice Potion a little bit more balanced. Not only is it incredibly painful to do, so much so that no one ever wants to do this, which immediately gets rid of the 7 Potters plan in Deathly Hallows, because good riddance, it's a stupid plan to begin with, and no one would want to do that if it meant permanent pain for taking part in it. The stakes and the sacrifice that would be needed in order to make a well-functioning Polyjuice Potion would be so high that it would be a crime to obtain that material in the first place, but it would also mean it would make it much harder to actually impersonate someone convincingly and believably. So you couldn't just walk around taking hair all over the place and just becoming whoever you want. You need to leave evidence, basically, that you committed this crime, because if you didn't take a sufficient enough sacrifice from somebody, your impersonation would just be imperfect and people would be able to tell. So all in, we'll call that one sorted. Avada Kadavra. All right, so Avada Kadavra is the spell that probably inspired me to make this video, because I kept thinking about Aragon. And at some point I'll make a video about Aragon. I don't really know what the content of that video will be, but someday I'll make it. I kept thinking about the way that killing spells work in Aragon, where you sort of pinch a nerve in some way, and that does the actual killing. It's a really interesting way that the rules and boundaries of the magical system that Christopher Paolini came up with, or I don't know if people like Christopher Paolini at this point or not, but the boundaries that he created informed the way that that spell could work. It pinched a brain nerve instead of, smashing someone or something. And it had me thinking about how Avada Kedavra has almost no downside except that it makes you evil. And so that was the moment where I thought, okay, how would I change that? It seems completely unbalanced that all the Death Eaters can run around shooting guns at people and the rest of the good wizards just have to walk around like shooting Roman candles at people. That doesn't seem balanced or realistic in any way. And so I've got 4 rules to try to rein some of this in: body, fate, mind, and sacrifice. So starting with the body rule, I think it just has to have an explanation for how Avada Kedavra actually kills. And to me, the most obvious way is that it just sort of turns the brain off. Instead of making it a mystical sort of like soul separation, it just sort of shuts the brain down. And perhaps the reason why it's so unforgivable is because of how low effort the spell actually is and remains after the rules that I introduce. There's going to be some other downsides, but at least from the unforgivable perspective, part of what makes it unforgivable is just how easy it literally is to cast. Someone at some point in the past found the most efficient killing spell possible, and there's just no way to combat it. And so to counter that, that's why I would introduce something like a law of the mind and some sort of empathy cauterization is what I wrote down. You have to, as the caster, damage your psyche, your mind, in some way to cast this spell, which I think is hinted at a little bit in the book, but I don't think Avada Kedavra specifically is damaging anyone's soul. I think Voldemort's soul is damaged through the creation of Horcruxes, but I don't think Avada Kedavra itself is damaging his soul. So instead, I think it's somehow actually damaging your mind in a way that stops you from feeling human empathy or emotion or like reading social cues. Maybe Avada Kedavra is the one that's causing autism. This video is going to get demonetized. Anyway, the second law, the law of mind, is something that is affecting and actually destroying the mind every time the spell is cast. Maybe successfully cast, maybe it has to actually connect for this damage to be done, or maybe not. Maybe every time you cast it, it is chipping away a piece of your psyche in some way. The third was an interesting idea that I was thinking about, which is how do I introduce fate and luck or probability into this in some way? And I wondered if maybe Avada Kedavra, part of why it's unforgivable, is because you're sort of swimming against the grain of the natural order of things. When you snuff out a life, fate or probability or chance or whatever marks you in some way. You are somehow labeled as unnatural. Certain things will just start to work against you, against your luck. And so maybe there are some tangible things, some that you could take from the story, like the Patronus side of things, where like, I don't think Voldemort can cast a Patronus anymore. Or like maybe Liquid Luck doesn't work for Voldemort. Just some like small, subtle ways of building on the consequences of using Avada Kedavra would be really helpful in explaining why everyone doesn't use this, especially when you're all fighting to the death. Doesn't make any sense. And so to sort of build on that would be this law of sacrifice, wherein if you hit someone with Avada Kedavra, it is actually siphoning a piece of your life force out of you. And so the only reason that someone like Voldemort is able to cast it so effectively and so indiscriminately is because of the Horcruxes that he has. This would mean that maybe the Death Eaters can't just run around like mad people shooting Avada Kedavra off at everyone, including children, because the consequences are so real and tangible. It's only going to be cast by people crazy enough to do this. So like Voldemort, Bellatrix Lestrange, I think that's the end of the list. How that actually works in the magical sense, maybe when you destroy someone else's soul, they latch onto a piece of yours and drag it with them. Maybe that explains the look that Voldemort has. Like maybe it's because his soul's age is actually like 700 years old because he's killed so many people. I don't know. The idea of making Avada Kedavra torturous to the caster in some way, I think is necessary, because otherwise it's just too easy for people to cast. And again, when you have a situation where it's horrors against Death Eaters and one side is allowed to shoot bullets and the other one can't, the stakes just don't make a lot of sense. And so I know there's a situation where Aurors were allowed to use unforgivable spells, but that's not satisfying either. I would want a world in which Avada Kedavra isn't just being avoided out of morality, but also out of some intangible effects, because the Aurors are using other spells that kill people. Like, it's not like Avada Kedavra is the only way that happens in the magical world, so there should be a reason why they're not using that particular spell. Clearly, if you stun someone in midair on a broom and they fall to the ground, they're not getting up after that. So I just think having a reason why they're not using Avada Kedavra makes the spell more real, more terrifying. What do you think about that one? Avada Kedavra is just such a weird spell within this whole series. Moving on. Felix Felicis. Okay, I lied. This was actually the thing that made me want to make this video. Liquid Luck has to be, hands down, the most unrealistic, the most immersion-shattering item, piece of magic within this story. I know everyone disagrees with me. Actually, no one disagrees with me about this. There are a select few of you that disagree with me about this because you think it's just way too hard to make, so it could never be abused. Or there's a group of people that think it's all placebo in some way. The third group thinks it's like the same effects as alcohol, which I don't think that's the case. That makes it sound like you've never drank, if that's what you think Liquid Luck is doing. I think Liquid Luck is magical, and I do think in the series it does make things go right for the drinker, which means that I think there's a plethora of ridiculous outcomes that are just the logical conclusion of a world where Felix Felicis does cause perfect luck to happen. We're talking economic collapse. We're talking world domination. What if Voldemort took Liquid Luck? What if? There's just no downside except for the fact that it makes you overconfident. And so I've got two rules to try to fix this. One, the law of fate, and two, the law of sacrifice. I've hinted at this one already. I think it's really the most logical solution here when we talk about fate, and that's that Liquid Luck works, but you're just borrowing luck from the future. And is it an equal amount of luck? I'm not sure. If you have 12 hours of good luck, does that mean you have 12 hours of bad luck? That still seems like maybe it's not equivalent, because the outcomes of having extremely unnaturally good luck for a period of time, like imagine if you win the lottery. Like maybe the amount of luck that you're sacrificing is related to your winnings from being on Liquid Luck. If you win the lottery and you win $1 billion in the Powerball, you might sacrifice 500 years of luck on the come down. I think luck should be a finite resource when it comes to Liquid Luck, and that should be something that has to be understood by the user. I think you might have to make realistic choices about how lucky you want to be, because the luckier you are, the worse your future is going to be. So Harry might find himself in a situation where he could really dial up the luck to get the solution super easily, but he might have to creatively find a way to do something that doesn't require quite as much luck, therefore sort of reducing his luck debt from the future. I don't know, I think that could put characters in really interesting situations where they're forced to take the extremely lucky solution, and they are forced to deal with the consequences of it. And you as the reader are forced to know that, like, oh, they've got something bad coming because of what just happened. I don't know, I think that could really build the stakes and the tension in a way that would be interesting. The other fix would be the law of sacrifice, the law of equivalent exchange. And I think this is a sort of a different idea from the Fate one, wherein maybe you have to sort of allocate that luck somewhere else in order for you to have that good luck. Maybe instead of using your future luck, you're using the luck of the surrounding people. And so there's a sort of moral trade-off to using Liquid Luck rather than sort of the personal one that might be the case in rule number 1. I think this is a totally separate solution, but it ends up putting characters and people using Liquid Luck in this like ethical dilemma where they know, if I take Liquid Luck, yeah, I'm gonna get out of this situation, but maybe everyone else that I'm with won't. I think to make everyone happy, you'd have to introduce maybe a third rule that I wasn't thinking about until now, which would be some rule of biology wherein Liquid Luck would become toxic to the taker, not in a way that just makes you overconfident. I think it would have to actually be toxic to you if you take in like more than twice. I don't know. I think you have to add maybe that other element in to make sure that like not every Death Eater is using it at every chance they can, because that still remains an issue. That's like if everyone in baseball was allowed to take steroids all the time. Maybe that would be a cool fight. I think in my mind, I am still more partial to solution one, where you're stealing luck from your future. I just really like the tension of this sort of looming disaster. It reminds me a lot of Kvothe in Kingkiller Chronicle when he talks to the Cathay, or I think it's Cathay, that can perfectly see the future and perfectly guides people towards destruction. And so the second that Kvothe has talked to them, he's sort of set his path and set his course towards destruction in some way. I think that looming disaster is a really interesting way to build the tension in a story. And it doesn't have to have a payoff like immediately in the same book. I think it could be something that Harry took in book 6 and the payoff doesn't happen until book 7 or, even later. That looming tragedy like off in the future, I think is a really interesting way to build tension within the story and make the stakes high enough that the characters don't necessarily want to take liquid luck just to like do better at Quidditch that day. Accio. All right, here goes. Accio. This is probably the spell that inspired the most comments in this video that was talking about spells, because of a comment that J.K. Rowling mentioned where she says that Accio summons things at, I think the quote is, close to the speed of light, which is just preposterous. So before we really dive into things, I'm just gonna go out and say that that's not possible. And I don't know if I'm gonna have a specific rule about that, but I'm just gonna assume that that's not physically possible in the world of Harry Potter. But I am gonna introduce 2 laws to make it make more sense. One is a law of mass, and one is a law of the mind. And maybe I also have to introduce a law of biology within this as well. We'll get to that in a second. I think first and foremost, Accio works, but you have to respect the inertia and the momentum of the objects that you're summoning. So when you summon something, you have to find a way to dampen the speed or cancel out the momentum as it approaches you. Otherwise, you're just going to get impaled by a broom. I think in reality, most of the training that happens with Accio when people are first learning how to use it is how to catch objects. I think there's a plethora of creative ways that people could do this. Like, I think you could use magic to maybe like siphon heat off from the object and convert the energy into heat. You could maybe link it to something else, like Name of the Wind style, so that you're siphoning off the momentum into a different object. Or maybe another way to think about it is that casting Accio is actually taking your speed and your momentum and giving it to that other object. So I think kind of in the same vein as Wingardium Leviosa, like the faster you can sprint, maybe the faster you can Accio something to you. But like maybe the consequences are A, things obviously can't travel at the speed of light, and B, you might be able to take some of your speed from the future and that might get an object to you more quickly. But the consequences might be that you're really slow or like frozen in place for a period of time until you sort of catch back up with your own energy. Maybe if you cast something and try to get it to you way too fast and from too far of a distance, maybe you freeze yourself for eternity. Maybe that's maybe a cause of death. This again reminds me of Aragon, wherein they have to be very careful that they don't cast something that can only end in success or the death of the caster. And so I think Accio might be an instance where that might be an interesting way to play that spell, where if you try to get something to you way too fast, you steal the rest of your speed for the rest of your life and you just get frozen in place. Like, I can imagine a world where that's the logical outcome from someone trying to move something too quickly, because that might be the other use of Accio. It might become an offensive spell. Imagine you don't try to dampen any of the speed. You could use it to fling projectiles at people. There is sort of the opposite of Accio, which is called like Depulso or something like that. I don't know. There's a way to push things away from you, but maybe you don't really need that. And Accio is just a way to use magic to like shoot projectiles at people. And each time you do that, you're taking some of your speed away. So there's a trade-off. You can shoot things at people, but it means you're kind of slowed down for a period of time until you catch back up. And if you shoot too many things at too many people, you're just frozen and you're just SOL. I don't know, this one reminded me of a lot of things. It reminded me of Aragon and the way that they cast spells. It reminded me of Name of the Wind, when Kvothe makes that arrow catcher, the Bloodless, I think he calls it, where it deflects arrows coming in by like unloading very heavy springs on the inside of it. I don't know, I just think it's like a fascinating way to approach the idea of slowing something down. And in the same vein as Kingkiller Chronicle, the other law I wanted to introduce was the law of mind. And this pertained to the way that people track things and what they're able to accio to themselves. As it's described in the book, you kind of just have to concentrate hard enough on something that you're at least passingly familiar with in order to bring it to yourself. Maybe it's easier with things that you're more familiar with, but there's really not a whole lot of limits to what you can bring to yourself. Harry's practicing by just like accioing dictionaries to himself back and forth across the room. And so I would propose a sort of restriction on what you're able to accio to yourself. I think you might have to know the object that you're summoning much more intimately than just like, I've seen a dictionary before, I can summon it. I think it would be things that you use daily, things that are sort of, like the back of your hand. Maybe not to the extreme of like the true names that are used in Kingkiller Chronicles or the true names that are used in Aragon. There's a theme of a lot of true names in Magic. I don't think it'd be quite that far, but I think you'd have to be way more familiar with the object. So I think Harry's Firebolt is a good example because he is intimately familiar with that, but other things I think would be much more difficult to accio. I don't know exactly what that limit is, but I think it would be something that would take exploring. And again, all these rules don't necessarily always work with each other, but this is more food for thought. So maybe if you can't summon things that readily, it means that Accio is probably not quite as offensive of a spell as I was just talking about, but maybe it could be. Maybe you bring certain objects into battle with you that you do know very well, that you can use to accio as projectiles towards people. Maybe it's like ball bearings or something. I can imagine a magical warrior that brings in a satchel of ball bearings to the battle every day, and that's what he uses as projectiles, and he whips them back and forth. I literally forgot about this, filmed another section, and then realized I had to come back for this. There is a quote in Deathly Hallows where someone accios salmon, like they accio a living thing, and it's never really talked about again. I would assume there's some sort of like weight limit to it or something. Like, I don't really know how to address this. I thought about a law of biology that somehow would limit the types of beings that you're able to summon, but I actually don't know where you draw the line. Like sentience, like you can summon a fish, but could you summon a dog? You wouldn't steal music. How does that go? You wouldn't like download a car? Is that what that commercial is? That's very funny. Anyway, you could maybe summon a salmon. You could summon like bugs. Could you summon a bird? Like parrots are pretty smart. What about like ravens and crows? What about like monkeys? Like clearly we're not allowing you to summon other human beings, are we? Because if we are, I don't know. That's basically just the Force. This is basically just Star Wars. So I feel like you need to draw the line somewhere. And so maybe it's like a weight limit and an intelligence limit, which has a whole bunch of other things that I'm not going to get into. We're just going to draw the line at no humans and also not more than like 20 pounds. So definitely no babies. I don't know where I'm going to put this in the video, but back to wherever I was. Before we get on to the next one, I just wanted to say thanks for watching. If you're liking this content, leave a comment down below, say hi, click the like button, click the subscribe button. I'm like close to 40,000 subs. It'd be really fun to get this channel up to 100K. Not too stressed about it. I don't know when it's gonna happen, but if you're liking the content, subscribing is always appreciated. Other options, I put these videos on Patreon ad-free if you want them there. There's memberships on the channel that gives access to the video a couple days early, and there's some custom loyalty badges and emotes and all that kind of stuff. And also there's a Discord for the channel. I've got a link for all that below. You can find all of it there. And if you're just here to watch the videos, that's totally fine with me. I really appreciate you. I put a lot of effort into this over the last year and a half, 2 years, and it's really fun to see the channel grow. So again, thanks for watching. Here's to more videos in 2026. Cruciatus Curse. All right, so I am going to get to each of the unforgivable spells. We're on to the second one here, the Cruciatus Curse. Cruciatus Curse. Cruciatus Curse. The main problem that I have with this is pretty similar to Avada Kadavra. in that there's just very little drawback to casting this spell. And in some ways you might say like that's what is making them unforgivable. You know, the canon explanation is that they are only used to cause pain and suffering or death, but I don't know, my non-canon explanation would also be that a component of this is just how easy all these might be to cast and how little downside there is to using them. I think the way that someone can use the Cruciatus curse indefinitely is tricky because it means that no matter how sort of resilient the victim is, eventually they're just gonna get tortured. And so I think there has to be something else going on here that limits its use. And so to do that, I've got two laws, one for the body and one for the mind. And so starting with the body, I think one way to make the Cruciatus curse a little bit more balanced is that using the Cruciatus curse on somebody is actually opening sort of a link between you and them. And in doing so, when you cast this on them, you're actually experiencing a portion of the pain that you're causing them. I don't know exactly what that portion is. Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Is it 100%? Do you experience the same pain just in a different way as the caster? I think all those are interesting answers because they act as sort of a natural screener and limiter to this spell. You can only torture someone as much as you can personally bear to suffer. And so, you know, the real torturers out there in chat, Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange obviously are insane. They're psychotic. So they can torture to the max. Your everyday, like, Lucius Malfoy probably isn't all that interested in experiencing a bunch of pain, and so he's probably not going to be very effective in casting this spell. I think most of the sort of hoity-toity Death Eaters probably don't want to feel pain in that way. I think they probably wouldn't be using this spell at all, or at least not frequently, or maybe not to the level that would be needed to sort of torture someone in this world. They'd be casting it at like a very low power, and at which point, I don't know what good it would even do in the first place. So, you know, that's rule number one. I think it puts a really natural limiter on it, except for the most extreme people, which you would expect to be okay with experiencing the pain in order to inflict the pain. And kind of hand in hand is a law of the mind. And I would propose here that in order to torture someone, you're actually burning positive and joyous memories within your own mind as fuel for this torture. If you use it too much, you just run out of joyful moments in your memory. They are literally seared out of your mind. And so again, you have a natural explanation for people like Voldemort and Bellatrix, wherein they've done it so much maybe that they truly are just shells of negative emotion. And it might be an explanation like for why Dementors aren't interested in that. You have people like Voldemort and Bellatrix who they aren't just crazy, they are crazy, but they're not just crazy. They've sort of sacrificed things that make them human in order to fuel their cruelty. And I might circle back to that idea when we get to the Imperius Curse as well, but I think it's an interesting way to frame the unforgivable spells in a way that makes it reasonable why no one else is casting them. Obliviate. All right, my main issue with Obliviate is that I think it's treated too flippantly. It's treated like it's a file on your computer that you can just sort of like put in the trash can and then delete. And I think, again, the stakes need to be higher. Memories in reality are some sort of like neural pathway. And so if you delete those, I think you're causing mental damage to the person. It's like a brain injury. And so I've got two laws to introduce. One, law of the mind, and two, law of the body. They don't necessarily go together. They're just maybe two different ways of approaching this. So for the mind, what if what you're actually doing is not deleting memories? You're just sort of overwhelming the victim with like garbage data. Like you're just inserting nonsense into their brain mixed in with all of their other memories, which effectively erases their mind. It might not just be like garbage memories. It might just end up giving them like phantom memories. It might end up impacting them in the way that like they don't know what's true and what isn't, what actually happened and what's a fake memory, which is way more diabolical than just like erasing their mind and potentially way more interesting. They just end up with this sort of neurological haze going on that doesn't just turn them into a bumbling idiot like Lockhart, and instead it has this real tangible effect and probably does end up in the same result, driving them kind of insane. The other way to approach it would be a sort of law of the body approach, wherein it is biology that you're affecting here. And so when you burn a memory, you're burning a mental pathway. So Lockhart in this instance isn't just confused. He literally has micro magical tunnels through his brain that start to bleed into the other motor functions in his day-to-day life. It's like magical CTE, but instead of logically coming from Quidditch, it's happening from a spell. Overall, I think the consequences of this actually make Obliviate much, much worse than how it's shown and portrayed in the series. Honestly, Obliviate kind of becomes an unforgivable spell to me. It is so abhorrent what it might do to people in my made-up fantasy reality that I think it might be an unforgivable spell at this point. And while Lockhart is severely mentally damaged by the time we see him again later in like book 6 or 7 or whatever it is, he also, prior to that, was like a serial lobotomist. He was running around obliviating people left and right. And so realistically, he should probably be in Azkaban, again, in my made-up reality. But it's not just Lockhart. There are other examples where I don't know if I'm gonna find the quote. I think in building the Hogwarts Express, they had a bunch of muggles work on it or something, and then the Ministry of Magic erased like 200 people's minds or something like that. That would be akin to like a much larger scale atrocity if they had to wipe 200 people's minds and it basically lobotomized part of the population. Much, much worse in that scenario. So overall, like these are rules that I think just make Obliviate a spell that is more reflective of what you're doing to a human being, because if there are no rules and you are just able to erase people's memories with a flick of your wrist, that is bad. And I think there should be rules around it in a way that explain the damage that's being done. Even if there's no damage done to the caster, maybe the damage is just that it is an unforgivable spell and it ends up with you in Azkaban should you be caught. I don't know. Open to other suggestions on this one. Obliviate's a bad spell. Love Potion. Love potions are almost in a similar vein as Obliviate. I think they are such a sort of trivialization of mind control that just kind of gets overlooked. They're just sold as like fun little potions to kids by the Weasleys, but they kind of like overwrite a person's judgment. There's not a lot of recourse for them. If you really wanted to, like in the case of Voldemort's mom and dad, she just kept giving them potions over and over. And there's not really a way to stop that. In order to fix some of this, I've got a few rules that I'm putting in place for love potions. So we've got mind, body, and sacrifice. And again, some of these things are still going to be bad things. And my laws are more just explanations to give stakes to what someone is doing to another person. So for the law of mind, what I'm suggesting is really the mechanism for how a love potion works, in that it would basically force the brain to prioritize a single person or idea or thing over everything else. Think basically SpongeBob fine dining and breathing, but, in real life. I think the consequences of this are that you could get someone to prioritize another human being over their own well-being if you gave them enough potion over a long enough period of time. Which kind of leads me directly into the second law, which is the body law. And I think this would be some sort of addiction loop. I think love potion might work in a way that is spiking dopamine such that the person taking the potion becomes addicted. I think the insidious part is that the victim might not even know what they're addicted to. They're just going to experience the crashes as the potion wears off. How bad the withdrawal is maybe is open to interpretation. Maybe it depends on how strong and how often they've been given the potion. Maybe at the upper end of the range, it is lethal, but at the very least, the high that someone's coming off of when they come off a love potion, I think is drastic enough to cause real damage to someone. Again, this doesn't make it any worse for the person using the love potion, but I think it makes the moral choice to use a love potion more of a line in the sand that hopefully children aren't just crossing for fun. And the third law would be a law of sacrifice. And this is another idea of like, how do you actually penalize the person using this potion? So I think in order for this to work, you probably have to be the one brewing the potion, and maybe it works similar to a Polyjuice Potion where there's a step or an ingredient within this where you have to sacrifice some of your own joy or happiness or love in order to make this potion work on somebody else. Or maybe the alternative would be like, to make someone love you, you have to make someone else hate you. Could be an interesting way to do it, and maybe both of those are time limited in some way, but that might be an interesting way to balance the scales in this situation. I mean, overall, I think just love potions might just not be quite as lighthearted as they show up in book 6, and realistically, they are sort of taking over someone's faculties, and so it should be treated like they're doing that. Veritaserum. All right, eagle-eyed viewers out there, if you've noticed that the time of day has changed a few times during this video, it's because of this little monster right here. Normally, when I record these videos, I do it in one long session, just over the course of a day. That's why if you look at other videos, it goes from like daytime to nighttime over the course of the recording. This time, I can get about maybe 45 minutes of recording in before someone else has other ideas. So, Veritaserum. Now, off the bat, I would say that Veritaserum is not quite as bad as some of the other items on this list. I think we hear from a few different sources about the limitations of truth potions and why they can't just be used for everything. But that said, again, I just don't think it goes far enough. The reality is, in a meta sense, the ability for something to discover the absolute truth of something kind of destroys all tension within the story. And while Veritaserum doesn't explicitly do that, the only time we see Veritaserum used is when it does do that. There's a lot of like hemming and hawing about like, well, we couldn't use it because he might have transfigured it into a different liquid inside of his mouth, or, you know, there's a lot of that kind of excuses made for why it can't be used in other places, but the only time we see it used in the book or in the movies is for getting Barty Crouch Jr. to spill his secrets. So with that in mind, I have a couple ideas on how to set some boundaries on Veritaserum. One law of sacrifice and one law of body. My mission here is just to add some stakes to this world. So starting with the law of sacrifice, I would suggest that maybe the truth is accessible through the use of this potion, but it comes at a price. And so perhaps every truth that is revealed through the use of Veritaserum burns it away out of the victim's mind. And so, yes, it might be useful in gathering information, but once you gather that nugget of information, it's gone. And so you have to use it with that in mind. You can't just go around giving everyone truth potion, because ultimately you would destroy the evidence that you need, and as a secondary effect, you would probably start to cause some serious mental damage to the person that's taking Veritaserum. And I think this is an instance where you would actually couple it with a second law here, the law of body, wherein the Veritaserum is creating a sort of confusion factor here. And the price of administering Veritaserum to somebody is that it shuts down any sort of filter that they have on their mind. They'll tell you the truth, but they're also going to tell you every irrelevant piece of information that they know. Therefore, it's not just easy to give someone the potion, ask them a question, and get the truth out of them. You're gonna ask them a question, and they're gonna respond with things that happened to them in their childhood, and it's gonna be mixed in together with the rest of the information that you're trying to seek. So not only is the truth potion going to damage the person, but it's also going to give the information in a way that is incredibly difficult to parse, and it's going to take days or weeks to actually delve through and find the answers that you're looking for. So suddenly I think it takes the truth potion from like a haha playful get him to spill his secrets type of thing to like, oh, this is actually going to be really harmful to this person, and the effort required on the other side is going to be quite a high barrier. I think in a practical sense, if we were to see this in the book, the way it might come out, at least the way that I've been picturing it, is kind of like in Game of Thrones, when you have jesters or somebody that appears to be sort of like a fool character, but they spout nonsense, and usually it's in some sort of poem or song or something. Like, it's not Moon Pie. What's his, Moon Face or Moon Boy or something like that? I'm not sure if he's actually some sort of more intelligent figure in that story, but every time he speaks, you're kind of reading through the book being like, certainly this means something, right? Like, surely the words that he's saying aren't just pure filler. Like, they have to mean something, and the whole like court fool appearance that he's putting on is just an appearance. That's how I'm picturing sort of the effect of Veritaserum happening here, where people just sort of spout nonsense, and you as the reader will be fed the relevant pieces of information, but you're gonna have to parse through a whole bunch of nonsense to find the actual answers there. I don't know, Veritaserum, not, I think, again, the worst offender in my book, but I still think the idea of a thing that just sort of erases all tension from a story is problematic, at least in a literary sense, because it just makes the story not worth reading when everything could potentially be solved by feeding someone truth serum. So with that in mind, those two rules, I think, maybe put some boundaries on it. Really, it's maybe just more extreme versions of what J.K. Rowling sort of put in place with Veritaserum, just dialed up a couple notches. Geminio. All right, Geminio or Geminio, I don't know which one it is. I think it depends on whether or not it's the curse version of the spell versus the non-curse version of the spell. Either way, it's the duplicating spell, and obviously it was going to be on the list today. My biggest gripes with Geminio are really more like on the economics side and the like utilitarian side of things. So with that in mind, the limitations I'm suggesting are a law of mass or physics, a law of sacrifice, and a law of body. And those might be interesting choices, but we'll get into all of them in a second. I'm gonna frame some of this with the description of the spell from the Wonder Book, which I don't know how canon that is, but as it says, one unfortunate quirk of this spell, which has never been successfully overcome, is that nobody can halt it but the original spellcaster. If, for whatever reason, he or she is interrupted, the object will continue to multiply for hours or even days until the copies start to degrade. So keep that in mind. That's one aspect here that I'm going to talk about. But again, there's some other things I want to talk about, so let's just dive into it. And maybe we'll start with that never-ending duplication problem with a law of mass. Some of these are different ways of solving the problem, but for the law of mass, what I had in mind is basically that when you duplicate the object, the resulting object has 50% of the mass and the original object has 50% of its mass. So over time, if you duplicate something enough, it just becomes nearly weightless and almost intangible at a certain point. And I think the eventual outcome of that is that if you duplicate something enough, it just kind of destroys it. It fades out of existence. There isn't a scenario where it reabsorbs all the duplicates over time. I think that it's a sort of permanent change that happens to the object that's being duplicated. And so therefore copies just don't continue to take up space and threaten to flood the entire world with duplicates of, imagine you were duplicating a car, and over time, if that car were duplicating for days or weeks on end, based on the speed that things duplicate in the one scene we see in Deathly Hallows and the Lestrange's vault, cars would flood the city within hours. They would crush everyone living there. So I just don't think that makes any sense. And so logically over time, each individual car starts to weigh less and less until it's a fraction of a gram, and then they just kind of wisp out of existence. So that's kind of the more like real world physics way of potentially describing it. The other solution I would have would be more of this law of sacrifice idea, where instead of sort of diluting the mass of an object, you're diluting the sort of presence of an object, which is a little bit more magical version of it. So basically the second version of something would be like 50% as corporeal, and then over time it would just become more and more ghost-like in its appearance and in its ability to interact with the real world. So in both of these scenarios, if you can imagine Harry and the gang back in the vault, when the coins and the gold starts to duplicate and threaten to crush them, that wouldn't happen in this scenario. They might still get burned alive by the duplicating fake money, but I don't think they'd be crushed necessarily, because again, at a very base level, you're just creating mass out of nothing, and that just doesn't sit right with me. But the reason that I even thought about this from a more like equivalent exchange perspective is what happens if you try to duplicate a living being? What happens then? So I have this idea for a law of the body, and it might actually impact the other two laws, but there's two paths to take here. One is, if you think about it in the way of the first two examples, duplicating a person and creating them in a version that's 50% of their original starts to turn into a sort of like body horror show where they're like 50% formed or 25% formed. And I don't know, like their brain isn't fully there, their lungs aren't fully there. I don't honestly know how someone survives in this scenario, honestly. So that led me to sort of a different solution, because that basically turns into an instant Avada Kadavra type of spell, and that's not where I wanted the spell to go. So my alternative suggestion here is that you need to introduce some sort of mana into the magical world. And that opens up a huge other can of worms, because Harry Potter doesn't have the characters don't have like pools of mana that they're drawing from like they might in other stories. Basically their only limitation is how hard they can concentrate or how much of a main character they are. And so without retreading every other topic on my list today, like if you introduce some sort of mana system, in this case, what if duplicating anything, whether it's an inanimate object or maybe another living being, takes mana spell juice from the caster, and maybe all of the duplicates are imbued with the mana of the caster in a way that they are weakened until the spell is released. And again, almost in an Aragon type of way, I can imagine a scenario where if you started duplicating things too much, you might just sap too much of your magical power away and find yourself, again, I don't know, either dead or in a coma or like unable to ever use magic again. I think that leads to more interesting scenarios and cases for the characters to solve, rather than just hope that the magic works. So all in, that does, I think, solve a few of my problems. A, from the like economics side of things, if the duplicates are clearly of lesser value, you can tell immediately that a gold coin weighs like a tenth of what it should weigh. You can't trick anyone with that, or it's turned semi-transparent, then obviously it's a duplicate coin. It might still have some value, it might have 50% of the value, and I think that's fine. The real issue here is the hyperinflation that happens if you can just duplicate gold indiscriminately, and if there's not a goblin around to check if it's a duplicate, I'm sure you could pay someone with a duplicate coin. You just like do the spell in your pocket and then hand them the duplicate coin and run away, right? So having some sort of sign that something is a duplicate fixes a lot of the problems for me. And then again, if you introduce mana or some sort of expendable energy in a magical sense to this world, again, huge other can of worms, but it does start to maybe solve some of the issues I have with this spell, and probably other spells as well. I mean, I don't know, that could be an interesting rewrite in its own way, where nothing changes about any of the spell except that they have mana costs associated with them, which basically is just a Harry Potter video game. I don't know, I'm rambling at this point. Most of my videos are just me rambling, so thanks again for watching. I'm glad you appreciate it. Maybe I just need a camera to vent to, and you all appreciate my venting. Imperius Curse. All right, on to our third and final unforgivable curse. The Imperius Curse is the one that controls someone else's mind and body and actions. Clearly ripe for all kinds of rules and limitations around how it can be used, because as it's shown to us in the book, there really is just about no limit to how you can use it. We have examples with Pious Thickness, where he gets Imperiused and is Imperiused from a distance over a long period of time and no one has to be near him. We also have examples with Draco, where he uses the Imperius Curse on someone who then, under control of Draco, Imperiuses somebody else. There's just no limits to this spell, and it opens up kind of this chain effect of Imperius spells that's possible that we're gonna try to rein in. So I've got 3 laws to introduce here: the law of the mind, the law of body, and a law of physics/mass. Okay, first is a very simple fix: the law of mind. I think that for you to be able to cast the Imperius Curse on someone, it needs to take a substantial amount of your mental focus in order to maintain it. I'm talking 90 to 100%. You are basically dazed or slouched over on a couch while you are controlling somebody else. Maybe if you're incredibly skilled, you can maintain composure enough to sort of walk around, but I think the idea of simultaneously holding a conversation with somebody else while you're controlling a third person, I don't think that should be possible. I'm basically thinking of this like a Naruto mind transfer jutsu or whatever it's called, like where they, I don't know, do that, and then you like fall over asleep on the ground. That's what I think this spell would realistically work like. Or the other way to think about it would be more of the Kingkiller Chronicles style, where Kvothe has to sort of split his mind off. You'd have to split your mind in some way, and you'd have to devote a portion of your brain to doing something else, while the other portion controls your day-to-day activities. Still, this is kind of like the first scenario where I don't think it's going to be easy or really even all that possible for most people to accomplish this. I think for most people, you're going to have to devote your entire focus to controlling a single person. Second is a law of body, which I think might be sort of related to the first one, in that I think the victim is able to actively reject this. We do see examples of this where Harry is able to suppress the Imperius demands from Voldemort, but in a more day-to-day sense, I think this would manifest in the victim having two inputs to all of their movements. If the caster wasn't sufficiently skilled, I think the victim would be able to fight it off over time, and they would be like shaking around and their movements would be erratic, and at the very least, it would not be a convincing impersonation, sort of like the Polyjuice Potion. I think people would be able to tell that someone was under control of the Imperius curse. And third is this law of mass or physics, whatever you want to call it. I think a limitation that has to be in place here is some sort of limit around the distance. The example in the book is Pious Thickness, where I believe a Death Eater casts an Imperius curse on him and then kind of like leaves, and he just maintains this Imperius curse from a distance over a long period of time. And I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. It just doesn't feel like it should be possible to me. I think logically there would be a sort of distance factor here, wherein the further away you got, the harder you would have to work to maintain that connection, and the easier it would be for someone to fight it off. Hi. She's becoming a monster, and I'm hoping this doesn't turn into a 4-day shoot. We're so close. There's a couple implications here. I've already talked about Pious Thickness, but the other one that I would talk about would be like Lucius Malfoy claiming he's under the Imperius curse at a certain point in time could be debunked because it would be an impossible feat for someone to maintain an Imperius curse for that length of time. Because A, the caster would have to be close to him at all times, or at least within a reasonable distance, I don't know, like 100 meters or something. And B, most likely that person would be like comatose on the ground. They couldn't maintain it while also eating 3 times a day, or I guess maybe you could hook them up to an IV to keep them hydrated and everything. But like, then again, would Lucius be important enough to devote a resource full time to doing that? Voldemort, even if he's incredibly powerful, I don't think even he could maintain more than maybe 2 Imperius curses at the same time. I don't know, maybe 3, but even still, like not enough and not at a large enough scale to actually command an army to work for him. So in this case, if these rules were understood and known amongst the wizarding community, Lucius Malfoy's claim would be a laughable one. It just wouldn't be possible or conceivable for anyone to maintain an Imperius curse for that amount of time over that distance. It's time to eat. Fidelius Charm. And we're back. If you're a struggling YouTuber that has tips and tricks on how to care for a puppy while recording videos, please leave your comments down below. All suggestions are welcome. Okay, the Fidelius Charm. I think in its current state, the Fidelius Charm is potentially one of the most underutilized spells in the whole series, despite the fact that maybe it's very difficult to cast. That withstanding, it should be used a whole lot more. I swear, this segment is probably 6 minutes long and it's gonna take me 45 minutes to film it. If I seem more disheveled than other videos, it's because I am. Okay. She's in her crate and she's listening to my brother and me on the speaker in the living room. I've got a few minutes to record now. Okay, so the Fidelius Charm. I've got a number of fixes for this in mind. 4, in fact. One of mind, one of sacrifice, one of mass, and one of fate. We all know about the Fidelius Charm, so let's just dive into the fixes that I have in mind. So the first is kind of an A or B scenario for mind or sacrifice. If we think about it from the mind perspective, what if I would propose that keeping a secret through the Fidelius Charm means causing some sort of harm to your own memories? What if holding a secret causes you to have some sort of memory leak? Depending on the size of the secret and the severity of what you're hiding, that leak would be smaller or larger in order to compensate. But what if instead of it being a random memory that leaks out over time while you're using the Fidelius Charm to keep a secret, what if you have to choose a memory to sacrifice in order to maintain that secret? I think this opens up an interesting scenario where you don't actually know what an exact equivalent is for the secret that you're hiding. And therefore, you might choose to sacrifice something that is or isn't enough to keep that other new secret. I think this is just interesting in that it opens up the kind of possibilities that lead to an interesting development in the plot. I don't know if the secret keeper themselves is the one that is sacrificing something or the people casting the spell. I don't honestly know. Maybe those are distinct. Like, is Peter Pettigrew the one that cast the Fidelius Charm, or is he just a third party when it gets cast and he's named as the secret keeper? I'm not totally sure. You can let me know in the comments. But imagine that the secret keeper maybe is the one that has to make the sacrifice. So Peter Pettigrew might make a sacrifice that he thinks is equivalent to hiding the Potters, but imagine a scenario where maybe he doesn't choose a good enough thing to sacrifice, and therefore the sort of fringes of the Potter secret become visible. I could take this one of two ways. Maybe he did this knowingly in order to allow Voldemort to find the Potters and start the whole saga. But, imagine a different scenario where maybe he wanted to protect the Potters in a different universe, and because he chose a not so great comparative secret, the fringes were visible, and Voldemort was able to find the Potters because of that. You could sort of pick at the threads of the Potter's house and find them. I think the flip side of that is that you sacrifice something much larger than what you're hiding, and maybe that just makes it an extra strong charm, but maybe you also just wasted something in exchange, like the birth of your firstborn child or something. Like, that would be probably like the utmost protection, but like probably overkill for hiding some everyday secret. Now, the next one is maybe a little bit niche for this spell, which would be the Law of Mass. And this would depend maybe on what you're actually hiding. So if you're hiding, for example, the location of the Potter's house, you are vanishing a house into sort of a pocket dimension. And I think doing that would take energy. Again, we're kind of back to this mana conversation for wizards and Harry Potter, but still, it would require some sort of constant concentration or energy to keep that secret hidden. And one way sort of around this that I can think of is that by telling the secret to more people, by having more secret keepers, it lowers the burden on every single secret keeper to the point where it's possible to keep a large secret for a long period of time. The obvious converse of that is that the more people that know, the more likely it is for the secret to leak or for someone to sort of sabotage the energy efforts required, all of which leads to maybe the spell failing at some point in time rather than it just sort of continuing for eternity until who knows when. Which brings me to the final law, which would be the law of fate. I think the canon explanation for Fidelius Charm is that if the caster dies, maybe the spell is removed. I'm like mixing up sources here, but I think there's a source that says if the caster dies, the spell continues on. And I guess what I would say is that if that is not the rule, then it should be. I think that the sort of cost of anchoring some secret to an individual is that if that person dies, you basically sent the anchor to the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and that secret's going to be in existence forever. So entrusting your secret to somebody else doesn't just turn into like, pick your best friend to keep it. It's like, oh, you're literally holding potentially my life in your hands. And so the risk is just much greater. And again, the stakes are much higher. If you had someone keep the secret about your location and then they died, you would essentially vanish off the face of the earth. So overall, I think really the Fidelius Charm just needs to have, again, higher stakes, make it harder to cast, make the consequences of casting it larger, make the energy required to maintain the secret something tangible, so therefore you have a reason to spread the secret to multiple secret keepers, and then potentially have some ultimate consequence for when the spell goes wrong. Wands. Okay, I wanted to round out this video with one final thing that wasn't really a spell, but is maybe the conduit for some of the spells that are cast in this world. The wand. It is the ultimate tool that's used by every single witch and wizard in this series, and yet I think, despite the fact that J.K. Rowling has fleshed out every type of wood that you can use in a wand, I still think it's underexplored. So as a sort of bonus ranking, I wanted to explore some limits around wands themselves. And to rein them in, I've got 4 different rules to apply. A rule of physics, a rule of body, a rule of mind, and a rule of fate. So starting at the physics layer, this may or may not exist in the world already, but if it does, I just think it needs to be way more pronounced. And that's that magic creates in some way, shape, or form friction. And a wand that is used in a very heavy battle, for example, is going to end up smoking or overheating or potentially failing if too much magic is channeled through it in too short a period of time. I don't think this is exactly shown. I mean, like, the thing that comes to mind is when there's the Battle of Seven Potters and Harry's wand instinctively pushes back against Voldemort and shatters that wand. I think it's Lucius's wand in that scenario. That's not exactly what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking, like, if you cast too many spells, your wand might just explode. And one nice little payoff of this rule is that it would potentially give a reason for the Elder Wand to exist. And the Elder Wand would exist as a wand that basically has no resistance to magic. It would never overheat, it would never explode on you. You could cast as much magic as you want, channel as much energy through it as you possibly could, and it would just accept all of it. That, I think, would be one way of putting actual value behind one of the Deathly Hallows, instead of the sort of nothing that all of them are in the series. The second rule would be a rule of body. This would kind of go hand in hand with the wand choosing the wizard, wherein I think the wand would in some ways literally be an extension of your body. And so if you try to use a wand that isn't yours or hasn't chosen you, it would react negatively. Not only would it not cast the spell that you want to cast, it might also like magically shock you in some way. There'd be some sort of like magical kickback if the wand didn't choose you in a way that would make you unable to perform magic with it. Not just because the spells wouldn't work, but because it would be like painful or impossible to hold onto the wand while trying to perform magic. And again, this might extend to the Elder Wand in such that if you try to use the Elder Wand without having ownership of it, it maybe would kill you. I don't know. Like, consequences and stakes could be much higher with something like that. Another one that definitely shifts this into much more hard magic territory would be the law of mind, except that I'm sort of applying the mind rule to the wand itself in this case, wherein what if the wand had a natural limit to the number of spells or the amount and diversity of magic that it could cast? This might give an actual reason for why a wizard would be picky and choosy over what wand they want to use, because some would naturally have a higher capacity for more spells. Maybe some are more attuned to certain types of magic and would be able to learn more spells than others. And again, tying it back to the Elder Wand, maybe that's the only one that has some sort of infinite capacity for new spells. This like very much turns it into a video game or something. I'm not crazy about this rule, but I was just thinking about how do you limit the actual magic that's being cast by a wand? And one way to do that might be with some actual limit, and then after you pass that limit, maybe it's not that the spells don't work at all, maybe they're just severely diminished in their effect, but something that would limit the amount of magic that a wand could do unless you sort of upgrade, or maybe you have to hot swap to like a different wand in your pocket. That could be an interesting way to do it. You're in the middle of a heavy battle and like your wand's overheating, you gotta like hot swap it and reload to the other wand. This is like turning into Harry Potter Call of Duty, but I don't know, that could be interesting too. Like an FPS Harry Potter game, does that exist? I don't know, maybe it should. And the last rule would be a law of fate. This is actually somewhat canon for the Elder Wand. I might just apply it to every other wand in the series, in that the wand would actively sabotage you if it wasn't your wand. We hear a lot about wands being somewhere in between just object and like sentient being, and I think finding a way to play up that potential sentience more and more would make the wands more interesting. Like, I wouldn't go as far as like having the wand be able to talk, but allowing it to make choices about what spells it's casting might be an interesting twist to throw into the type of magic that a character can use. I mean, maybe you even throw in like sort of emotions into the wands as well. Like, could a wand get scared or nervous or get like stage fright and not be able to cast a spell effectively? You know, all of it rides on the wizard or witch themselves, but what if you split that responsibility of casting magic to a combination of the magical user and the wand that they're using? I don't know, I think it opens up the door to having combat be much more interesting in Harry Potter. I know the movies basically just turned into like throwing firecrackers at each other, but the books were always a little bit more engaging with the duels that were happening. I just wish it could be more creative. I think pointing a stick and saying abracadabra is not satisfying to me, and it might just be that it's a children's book, and that's fine. I think I just prefer combat in magical series where the magic is harder. I think the characters have to make more interesting trade-offs, and there's more tension in what they're doing, and so making some changes to the wands might facilitate some of that extra action happening in combat. All right, I think we've finally made it to the end. This video has taken me 3 days to record, so I appreciate you sticking with me. I'm sure this is going to be a divisive video, but if anything, it's just an interesting way to explore the world here. If you have thoughts, leave them in the comments. You're probably not going to agree with everything I said. I probably don't agree with everything I said, but I appreciate you watching. Reminders before we go, there's memberships on the channel, there's a Patreon that's ad-free, there's a Discord channel if you want to chat with me over there, and of course there's plenty of other videos that you'll like on this channel. If you want to look at some of the spells that I ranked in terms of how much of a plot hole they are, you can check out this video here. I did the same thing with items within the magical world. The most recent video was ranking wizarding careers, which is over here somewhere. You get the picture. There's plenty of content on the channel. Go check it out. I appreciate you stopping by. Click the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. I don't know if I'll ever make it to 100K on this channel, but it'd be a fun milestone to get there. But with that, I got nothing else to say. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.